Sí, primero quisiera presentarles a nuestra invitada, la profesora Tropp. Ella es académica en la Universidad de Massachusetts, en Boston. Quienes han trabajado han tenido la oportunidad de conocer la literatura que ella ha investigado ya por muchos años. Tiene una trayectoria muy significativa en el ámbito de los estudios de las relaciones de contactos entre grupos humanos, y una serie de factores, ustedes van a ver parte de su presentación, aborda estos temas que están referidos a cómo cambian las actitudes cuando las personas se vinculan a propósito de lo que se conoce como la hipótesis de contacto. Con Linda tenemos ya una larga trayectoria trabajando juntos, estamos implementando una serie de estudios acá en Chile de largo plazo. Esta es una presentación que además viene apoyada por dos centros que tenemos, en los cuales estamos vinculados. El centro está ubicado acá en Sociología, que está orientado al estudio de temas interculturales en el pueblo originario, que es un proyecto FONDAP, y el proyecto FONDAP de conflicto y cohesión social, que está recién comenzando a funcionar acá también en Psicología, en el Centro de Medición. Estos dos centros están coordinándose para poder invitar académicos que vengan a nutrir nuestra agenda de investigación, y nos pareció súper pertinente vincular esta presentación a lo que Linda hace, porque está completamente vinculado con los temas que estamos abordando en estos centros. Entonces, dejo con ustedes a Linda. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation to be here and to share a little bit about the work that I've been doing and that many people in our field have been doing. What I'd like to do in this talk is just share with you a little bit of information about more generally research and theory on intergroup contact, and then talk a little bit more specifically about contact between members of different status groups. So, for those of you who might not be as familiar with the social psychological literature on intergroup contact, we generally come from the premise that positive contact between members of different groups can help to reduce prejudice and promote a range of positive intergroup attitudes. And here I just want to specify that we're talking about contact as face-to-face interaction between members of different groups. And I mention this because in many other disciplines, contact is oftentimes assessed or measured in terms of proportional indices or percentages of a group in a neighborhood or in a community. And we would probably regard that as an opportunity for contact, that there are members of other groups in your social environment with whom you might interact. But for the purposes of this presentation, most of the research that we're conducting in social psychology, we're really talking about contact in terms of actual face-to-face interaction between members of different groups. And when we talk about why contact might be effective in reducing prejudice, we often talk about certain conditions under which the contact should occur. And these were articulated in a most influential way by Allport back in 1954 and have received a lot of empirical support over the last several decades. And these conditions that are optimal for contact include such things as having equal status between the groups within the contact situation, that even if they might have different statuses in the larger society, that they are regarded as equals when they are brought together to interact with each other, that the contact occurs with support from institutional norms and institutional authorities, that there are authorities in that context saying, yes, you should interact with each other and you should interact as equals, and that the groups should work together cooperatively toward the pursuit of common goals. Now, although these were articulated as optimal conditions back in the 1950s, since that time, there's actually been a lot of debate about contact's effects. Some people say that contact is very effective in reducing prejudice. Some people say actually contact does very little to reduce prejudice. Some people say that contact might reduce prejudice in some contexts, but not reduce prejudice in other contexts. So there's been a lot of debate in the research literature about the effects of intergroup contact. So to try to get clarity on the nature of the relationship between contact and prejudice, I conducted what's called a meta-analysis of intergroup contact effects with Thomas Pettigrew, who's my co-author on the book listed there. And for those of you who are not familiar with meta-analysis, you basically try to find every single study ever conducted on a topic, and you statistically combine those studies to look at the overall effect. Overall, does contact reduce prejudice? And also to see if there are other factors that might enhance or decrease the possibility that contact will reduce prejudice. So for our quantitative integration, this meta-analysis that we did, we found a total of 515 studies examining the effects of intergroup contact. And they span from the 1940s through the year 2000, and include slightly over 250,000 participants from 38 different countries. I also just want to note that participants in these studies come from many different types of groups and had contact in many different types of settings. I'll share some of those examples of data with you so you can see the nature of the effects of contact across groups and settings. And I also wanted to clarify that these studies come from a wide variety of disciplines. So we didn't only look at those studies on intergroup contact from psychology, but we also looked at studies from sociology, political science, medicine, social work, education, gerontology, many different fields. So one of the basic questions we wanted to address was overall, what does this literature tell us? Does intergroup contact reduce prejudice? And we find that overall, greater levels of intergroup contact are typically associated with lower levels of intergroup prejudice. And I want to give you a better sense of what you see in this graph here. So for each of those dots in that slide, that represents one study of intergroup contact and the relationship between intergroup contact and prejudice. So what you're basically seeing is the distribution of the correlation, the relationship between contact and prejudice across all of those individual studies plotted in the graph. On the x-axis, where you see 0.0, that basically means, that value means that there's no meaningful correlation, no meaningful relationship between contact and prejudice. For positive values to the right-hand side, that means that contact would be associated with more prejudice. For negative values on the left-hand side, that means that contact is associated with lower prejudice. And you can see that the majority of the cases in the distribution are to the left-hand side of the 0 point, suggesting that overall, greater contact is associated with lower levels of intergroup prejudice. And we find that actually 94% of the cases in the analysis show this effect to some degree, that to some degree, greater contact is associated with less prejudice. Now you can also see a red line in the middle of that distribution. That represents the mean, the average effect between contact and prejudice for all of those cases. So on average, the relationship between contact and prejudice corresponds with a correlation coefficient of -0.21. So it's a relatively modest correlation, but it's a highly significant correlation given the effects, the sample size for these effects. But it's also a relatively stable and consistent relationship, as you'll see in some of the next slides. Before I go through some of the other slides, I want to just give you a sample graph so that you can interpret what you're looking at in relation to the previous graph. So again, here, the value of 0 would mean there's no meaningful relationship between contact and prejudice. Positive scores would mean that contact is associated with more prejudice. Negative scores, that contact is associated with less prejudice. So when we look at this overall effect of contact, it could be that this overall relationship is really reflecting the contact that people had with individual outgroup members in the contact situation with whom they interacted, rather than affecting attitudes towards that other group as a whole. So we conducted some additional analyses to examine this issue by looking at each test of the relationship between contact and prejudice, and to compare cases where prejudice was assessed in relation to the individuals in the contact situation as compared to prejudice towards the group as a whole, as a way of generalizing beyond that contact situation. And what we find is that there are virtually identical mean effects whether we're talking about the relationship between contact and prejudice toward the individual members of other groups with whom you had contact, or whether we're looking at the relationship between contact and prejudice towards that group as a whole, suggesting that positive contact experiences with individual members of other groups can generalize to more positive attitudes towards those groups overall. Now, we also wanted to see whether the effects of contact might vary across these different groups and contexts, as I started to say before. So we compared the effects for the relationship between contact and prejudice depending on the target group, whether it involved contact between heterosexuals and homosexuals, people with and without physical and mental disabilities, different racial and ethnic groups, or people with and without mental illness. And consistently what we find is that typically greater intergroup contact is associated with less intergroup prejudice. We find a similar trend when we look at the different settings in which contact occurred. So for example, in recreational settings where people from different groups play on sports teams together, for example, or are in clubs together, research in laboratory settings, organizational or work settings, educational settings like school, and residential settings like neighborhoods and housing projects, we consistently find that overall, greater intergroup contact is associated with lower intergroup prejudice. We also find this when we look at the relationships between contact and prejudice for studies conducted in many different parts of the world. Again, pretty consistently what we see is that greater contact predicts lower levels of intergroup prejudice. So in part, we find pretty consistent findings related to this relationship, but there are some ways in which we see differences across the studies as well. So for example, if we look at the types of contact that people have, compared to the general effect, the blue bar, that correlation of -0.21, we find that contact generally has stronger effects in reducing prejudice when the contact is in the form of cross-group friendships, or when the contact occurs under those optimal conditions, like equal status, cooperation, and with institutional support. So we're seeing that contact tends to be effective in reducing prejudice, and especially when it occurs under these optimal conditions. But we wanted to also ask whether contact can do more beyond just reducing prejudice. And our work and others' work suggests that beyond just reducing prejudice, having positive contact with other groups can also help to promote intergroup trust and forgiveness, and also encourage support for policies that would benefit groups beyond our own, that we care more about those other groups and are more concerned about their welfare and support policies that would support their welfare. And I want to give you an example of one of these studies that I conducted with colleagues in South Africa. This was a national phone survey of almost 800 white South Africans, and we included measures of positive contact, including measures reflecting those optimal conditions, like being cooperative, having equal status, and being friendly. We also assessed white South Africans' prejudice towards black South Africans, their feelings that black South Africans posed a threat to their ability to have jobs and resources. And we also asked about their policy attitudes. And we asked about two types of policy attitudes. On the one hand, compensatory policies, which would be policies that would promote black advancement, like education and training programs, and also preferential policies, which would be more like affirmative action programs in many cases where black South Africans might be preferred or chosen over whites for land, for grants, for fellowships, for positions in government, and things like that. What we find is that in relation to both types of policies, positive contact is significantly predicting greater support for policies that would promote black advancement. And this is even after we take into account those white South Africans' initial prejudice toward black South Africans and their feelings of being threatened by black South Africans. So it suggests that there's a unique role that contact is playing, this positive contact between white and black South Africans is playing in whites' willingness to support policies that would help the black community in South Africa. Now, in addition, we were also interested in seeing whether contact could help to promote reconciliation among communities that have had a history of conflict, or particularly violent conflict. So we conducted some additional research to look at the potential for positive contact after that conflict to promote reconciliation. And as part of that, we included measures of both positive contact, like I described before, being cooperative, friendly, and equal in status, but also looking at negative contact and how negative intergroup experiences have the potential to undermine the positive effects that friendly contact might have. So we conducted some research in Northern Ireland with a community sample of Protestant and Catholic participants. We included measures of both positive contact and negative contact. Again, positive contact being like those measures I talked about before, being cooperative, equal status, friendly, and close. whereas negative contact involves having experienced political violence in your neighborhood growing up due to the troubles, and also personal suffering. How much have you personally suffered due to the violence between these communities? In terms of what we're trying to predict as outcomes, in part to be consistent with prior research, we were interested in looking at the effects of contact on intergroup attitudes, if it would promote more positive attitudes towards the other community. Also the extent to which positive contact might make you more willing to trust the other community. And we also wanted to look more specifically in the context of reconciliation and ask people about their beliefs regarding the other community's intentions in working toward peace. So we asked questions to say, well, in working toward peace, do you think that that other community has positive intentions, that they really care about peace, they really want peace? Or negative intentions, that, well, they say they're working toward peace, but they're really trying to achieve other goals, or they're just trying to gain power and are using this as a strategy to make it look like they're working with us. So more positive and negative perceived intentions of the other community. So entering all of these variables as predictors for intergroup attitudes and trust, we find that positive contact is continuing to predict more positive attitudes towards the other community and more trust in that other community, even after taking into account the negative contact experiences they might have had in terms of neighborhood violence as they were growing up and personal suffering due to the intergroup violence. And we also find that positive contact is predicting more positive beliefs about the other community's intentions, that they genuinely want peace, and is less likely to predict negative intentions. That the more positive contact I have, the less I think that they're just trying to use this for strategic reasons, that they really care about peace. So we've seen a few ways in which intergroup contact might promote positive outcomes, not just in terms of reducing prejudice or promoting positive attitudes, but also promoting trust, promoting support for policies that would benefit other groups, particularly disadvantaged groups, and also promoting reconciliation between groups that have had a history of conflict. But we also have to consider whether intergroup contact might function differently for different groups within that contact or conflict setting. So we wanted to return to our data from the meta-analysis to examine this issue. And what we find is that group status does matter. So if we compare those groups where they were in the dominant position or the high status position, you tend to see stronger effects of contact on reducing prejudice for those majority dominant groups as compared to the lower status minority groups. And this is the case whether we look at all of the different types of groups that we included in our analysis, or if we only separate out and look at racial and ethnic groups. So what this suggests is that when members of different racial and ethnic groups come into contact across all of the studies in our analysis, and the racial and ethnic cases were about 50%, about half of our sample, what you find is that you're going to see more positive change in attitudes for the majorities, the dominant group, and less change for the minorities, or the subordinate group. So this is just one example to suggest that there's a difference in group status that matters in interpreting context effects. We wanted to see if we could replicate these findings. So we used data from a national survey conducted in the United States that included large numbers of respondents from white and Black American adults. We had to use, being a secondary analysis, whatever measures they had in that data set. So there was a measure of general contact, whether people currently have contact with a person who is white or Black, and we're looking at the other group in this case. We also had a measure of positive attitudes, how close do you feel to that group overall? And then we had a bunch of demographic variables, including the respondent's age, their gender, level of education, family income, and political ideology. And what we did was we wanted to look at the relationship between contact and this attitudes measure of intergroup closeness overall, and then separately for whites and Blacks. So overall, for all of the respondents, we see a relationship that's fairly similar to the mean effect in the meta-analysis, that overall, greater contact is associated with more positive intergroup attitudes. Yeah? And this is the case whether we just look at R, the bivariate correlation coefficient, sorry if that was technical, or the partial R, where we're controlling for the role of the demographic factors. Okay? similar patterns in both cases. But when we separate out the data for black and white respondents, we start to see a real difference in the patterns, that contact is a much more robust predictor of positive attitudes among white Americans, the dominant group, and a much weaker predictor among black Americans, the lower status group. So in our research, we've been finding that it's not simply that contact has different effects for members of high status and low status groups, but members of different status groups might also have different views or expectations or experiences in the contact. So I want to give you just a little bit of an example of some of the research we've done in this area. So in one study, this time with undergraduate students, we collected data from, in the United States, ethnic majority participants or white students, and also ethnic minority participants, which included a combination of students from many different racial and ethnic backgrounds. And what we asked them to do was a very simple preliminary study where we asked them to report their own interest in contact with members of other groups, and we asked them to provide open-ended responses to this question that I have here. So specifically, in society today, people often talk about diversity and how important it is to include members of different groups. Even though claims are made that diversity is valued, people still vary in the degree to which they believe those claims or trust those claims are true. What do you think? Do you think people generally value diversity? And then we had them write narratives just expressing their views. That was pretty much it. The first, I'll give you first some examples of the
well, it's not really a question, it's more like an answer. About what you say, the difference between the status of the group and the difference of the effect of the content in the reduction prejudice. Because in the study we are conducting here in Santiago and Temuco, we have kind of little situation because there is a conflict between Mapuche and the Winca, that we are the kind of the white people. This conflict is kind of escalating. It's turning a little more violent in the last months. So I kind of expect to find some weird results with that, because I think the perception of the Mapuche people will be that the Winca, us, we don't like to establish contact with them, and probably the answers of that sample will be a little, I don't know if corrupted is the word, but will be an effect of that situation in the study.
Yeah.
So maybe this is a real question, but if you have some evidence of studies that were conducted under this kind of situations in your meta-analysis?
So the tradition of the contact literature has been to focus on, it's really been focused more on trying to improve relations, particularly after conflict. So there aren't panels of national surveys that look at patterns of interethnic attitudes, such as in South Africa and Northern Ireland, just to see overall, do the groups hate each other, are they getting along? Same in the United States. What you also find in those types of surveys, particularly in the United States, is divergent views on how the different groups are treated. So for example, white Americans are like, yeah, blacks are treated the same as whites. And blacks say, no, blacks are not treated the same as whites. Pretty consistent. The gap between them varies over the years, but it's still a gap. I've never seen a survey where there was not a gap. So there's differences in the consciousness or awareness of discrimination. But what you were describing actually reminds me of this slide, where if you think that, if you're Mapuche and you think that non-Indigenous Chileans value diversity or want to include you in the society, you'd be more interested in interacting with them. It just seems that the mean is, I don't think they're actually interested in interacting with us. Kind of like what you see with the ethnic minority respondents here, that first green bar. So that actually seems quite parallel. I think one of the other issues, I didn't present these data, but I've done some experimental studies looking at what happens when ethnic minority and majority respondents mention group membership as they prepare for an interaction. So for example, I wonder what Mapuche would think about this. Or I wonder what non-Indigenous Chileans would think about this. You see very different responses to that among white and ethnic minority students in the United States. So for example, if a white student is preparing for an interaction with an ethnic minority student, and an ethnic minority student says, I wonder what whites think about this. They want to avoid the interaction, they have no interest in interacting with that ethnic minority student. But if an ethnic minority student reads about a white student who says, you know, I wonder what ethnic minority students would think about this, that increases the ethnic minority student's interest in the interaction, because it suggests that that white student is aware of the fact that race or ethnicity might matter. It's usually a taboo topic that they don't address. So, you know, as you guys think about future interventions, I mean, I know you have measures of, you know, perceived outgroup interest and things like that that I'm sure we'll be talking about in the months to come. But, you know, in looking toward future interventions, it might be a strategy like, how can we actually get non-Indigenous Chileans to talk about the experiences of the Mapuche? You know? And how can we transmit that genuine intent to learn more to the Mapuche population so that they might have a little more confidence? You know, kind of like the, kind of like the beliefs about intentions, right? They're genuinely interested in learning more about us. They're not just doing it to say, oh yes, we're all good, we're all multicultural. So, those would be my thoughts.
That's a very good idea.
A question about if you have some measures for perceived social status of the participants, or a cultural preference in your model, because I think that you can have some different results if you controlling for example, if I am Latino, for example, I can feel more near of the Caucasian culture than other participants. I don't know. I think that these variables can have some relevant effect in your model. I don't know.
Yeah, so the first, or I guess the second question that I'll answer first is about acculturation preferences. We do not have measures of acculturation preferences in these data. I'm going back to this slide because this was part of that larger UCLA data set that Jim Zbigniew and his colleagues worked on, where they actually used a lot of these data in their 1999 book on social dominance. And there's a slide in there, not a slide, I guess it's a page with a graph, but there's a graph where they plot on one axis the perceived social status of the group for white, Latino, Asian American, and Black American students. And what you see there is that white students, among all four groups, overall, whites are perceived to have the highest status, then Asian Americans, and then Latinos and Blacks are very near the low end of the status scale. Now, so I think your instinct is a good one because we also included data for Asian Americans. And I didn't include them here because there's an ambiguous thing about the findings, but first I'll explain it. In the paper we have it, that you don't see the same significant relationships between having white friends and perceiving racial discrimination, or between having white friends and ethnic activism among Asian Americans. Now you might think, oh, it's simply because they have higher status, along the lines of your hypothesis. I think an alternate hypothesis is that perhaps in part because of their higher status, the measures can't capture what we really want to know. All we know is that they perceive discrimination. We don't know from whom. So it could be that it's not that they're perceiving discrimination from whites. Having white friends isn't the predictor. It's having Latino friends or having Black friends that would make the difference. So in future studies, I think we need to be more specific and saying to what extent do you perceive discrimination from whites, from Latinos, from Blacks, from Asians, to be able to see more direct correspondence. So those are kind of the two interpretations that we have in this paper for why Asian Americans don't seem to show the same effect as what we see for the more clearly lower status groups, because when they're thinking about perceived discrimination, they're thinking about whites doing it.
¿Más preguntas?
Just a general question about the first part of the need analysis. Because, as you said, the mean, the average effect is minus 0.21.
Yeah.
I would like you to maybe to comment about this, because yours is a small effect size.
Yeah.
And what do you think about it?
Yeah.
It's still contact with a strategy for reducing prejudice, or maybe there's competing strategies when you're thinking about maybe public policy implications.
Yeah.
Would you put your tokens in the contact strategy, or maybe some other strategy?
I think that's a great question, and you might not be surprised. It is not the first time I have had that question. So this is the thing. The way that I think about it is, given the hundreds of influences in our daily lives, having one variable that accounts for about 4% on average across many different studies that have a lot of diversity and variability, that makes me a little happy, okay? Then, when, and if you look at the 2006 paper or 2011 book, you'll see all the methodological tests that we did. So for example, we assessed, we looked at not only the design of the study, showing that contact causes change in prejudice, as I discussed before. We also coded the reliability of the measures used to assess contact and prejudice. Very consistently, what we find is that the more reliable the measure, if it was an experimental manipulation or a highly reliable multi-item measure, you see much stronger effects. We also looked at potential for participant choice. So we coded for whether participants freely chose to engage in the contact, if it was self-selection, or if they kind of had to by virtue of the structure of the environment. No significant difference. You see consistent contact effects. We looked at published and unpublished studies to see if there was a bias that only published studies show significant effect. No difference. We looked at what's called a fail-safe index to see how many more studies averaging zero effect we would need to find to undo the significant effect. We would need, I think it was like 1,200 additional studies to undo the significance of the effect. Another thing that we looked at was combining all of those rigorous indicators. So for example, if you look at a very small subsample of cases that use experimental procedures, testing cause and effect, with reliable measures, good control groups, that's another thing. Oftentimes the control group had contact too. So you're basically making it really hard to see any significant effect. And we actually, it's a beautiful slide, I wish I had it up here. You see, survey studies with kind of a moderate effect, contact studies with control groups that also had contact show very weak effects, contact studies where the control group had no contact show very strong effects. It's like linear for like a little, some, a lot. So if you take all of those factors into account, the mean effect size becomes about -0.38, -0.39. So we're starting to account for more variance. But again, even that includes so many different types of studies. It includes Chinese immigrants in Malaysia. It includes Japanese housewives in the UK. It includes police interacting with African American youth in cities in the United States. It includes nurse practitioners in their first year of residency working with schizophrenics for the first time. It includes so many different types of studies. So if you're seeing increasing robustness of an effect with increasing attention to research rigor, even across all of that variability, it leads us to suggest that there's something there. Yeah.
Sí.
Yo voy a preguntar en español.
¿Está bien?
Quizá para el entendimiento popular es muy obvio la definición de estatus de un grupo, pero yo quería saber en tus estudios con el estudio de metaanálisis, ¿cómo se define o cómo se operacionaliza el estatus de un grupo? ¿Tiene que ver solo con ingresos económicos o con algo más?
No, okay, so I'm sure you all understood that question, but just in case you didn't hear it, that's basically the question of how are we operationalizing or defining status in the content meta-analysis. So the way we defined it, it wasn't in terms of socioeconomic status. It had to do with the target group that was the focus of the contact, of the intergroup relationship. So for example, here, we're looking at the negatively stereotyped, devalued, stigmatized, low status group. So, with sexual orientation, heterosexuals would be higher status than homosexuals, gays, lesbians, transsexuals, bisexuals. Physical disability, people without physical disabilities would be higher status than those with physical disabilities. People with mental illness would be lower status than people without mental illness. In terms of race and ethnicity, we generally treated whatever was the majority group, so it could be Germans and Turks. It could be Dutch and Moroccans. Basically whichever was the focus of the intergroup relationship where one group clearly had higher status and the other group clearly did not. Some studies, it wasn't clear. So for example, some studies in organizational psychology that look at different work groups interacting with each other within a large company, they are peers. There's not really a difference in status, but sometimes there was a merger where the parent company, had more control and access to resources than the lower status. So it really depended on the nature of the intergroup relationship.
En el caso en el que mencionaste que los asiático-americanos tenían mayor estatus que los afroamericanos.
Sí, pero eso fue en un cuestionario. That was the longitudinal study. Eso no fue parte de the meta-analysis study.
Ok, pero ¿por qué en este caso son de mayor estatus?
No son, they are not the majority status. Well, actually now at UCLA they might be, because there's a greater proportion of Asian American students at UCLA than any other group. At the time, they weren't necessarily the majority, but relatively they had higher status. So, for example, if this is the status scale, whites would be up here, Asian Americans would be here. They're still lower status than whites, but higher status than Latinos and African Americans. So it's a relative status, not a dominant group and a low status group in that case.
¿Algún otro comentario? ¿Sí?
Lo voy a hacer en español. ¿Hay algún estudio que haya investigado sobre los pensamientos, las emociones que cambian como a través de un mayor contacto entre los grupos? Como que expliquen como este cambio que ocurre después en las creencias.
Yeah. So, so there's actually, I have to explain one other thing about the meta-analysis in relation to the question. So, thinking about how beliefs or emotions might change, not simply prejudiced attitudes. We use a really broad definition of prejudice in gathering these studies. So, I don't have it with me. I can send it to you later. But that was another part of our analysis that we did, was looking at how prejudice was measured. And we found many different ways in which prejudice was measured. Sometimes as beliefs about another group, or about that group's position in society, that they don't deserve what they have, things like that. Sometimes it's stereotypes, that they're lazy or smart. Sometimes it's emotions. I like those people. I feel good about spending time with them. I'm nervous around them. So there was emotions, favorability, liking, stereotypes, beliefs, all sorts of measures. What we actually find is when we code them for the different types of measures, it's those measures that assess prejudice in terms of emotional processes, such as favorability, I like them, or emotions, I feel safe or comfortable around them. And that show the strongest effects. The weakest effects are for beliefs and stereotypes. But again, this is, as meta-analysis, it's often criticized for comparing so many different types of studies with different populations, different measures, different procedures. So we replicated. We did a survey of white American undergraduates responding in relation to Black Americans. We asked them a bunch of contact measures. We asked them a huge number of questions about different types of prejudice. And we found that those different prejudice measures loaded onto two factors. One that was more affective, emotional prejudice, one that was more cognitive, your thoughts in relation to prejudice. And then we looked at two contact measures in relation to those factors. We looked at how many Black acquaintances you have, so just people you know but not very well, in that other group, or how many black friends you have, okay? So imagine you've got black acquaintances, black friends, affective prejudice, and cognitive prejudice, okay? So just imagine arrows between those. What we basically find is that when you look at the effects for having black acquaintances, you don't see any significant relationship with either affective prejudice or cognitive prejudice because having black friends is already in the model. That suggests black friends is playing a more important role, and if you know about black friends, you don't need to care about whether they have black acquaintances or not. It's not adding any more to prediction. Then when you look at the relationships between having black friends and its relationship to affective, emotional prejudice, or cognitive prejudice, we see a significant relationship that greater numbers of black friends predicts less affective prejudice, no relationship, no significant relationship between having black friends and cognitive prejudice. So what this is suggesting is that there's a special role of emotional or affective processes when we think about contact prejudice relationships, both when we think about the type of contact in terms of friendship, closer, more emotional, but then also in terms of what we're trying to change. That when we have contact, we're more likely to change how much we like people in other groups, not as much what we think about them.
I would like to comment some of your ideas. Could you put the slides where you show the optimal condition effects? I think the third one, is that one? No?
No.
Oh, did I? No. Here.
Yeah.
That one. And this is very critical evidence for the research in contact. And obviously you can see the blue column reflecting the 2.21 minus 0.21, right? Which is rather a small effect. But the interesting finding here is that you can see a positive growing effect as long as you get what people call the optimal conditions. So a jumping almost 0.3 negative. And this is across the several studies on that context. So adding the optimal condition also increase the quality of effect of contact.
And could I add one thing? That effect for the optimal conditions is after controlling for all of those methodological variables, like the reliability of the measures and the study design. So it's not a function of better studies. After you look at the better studies and take into account all of the variability associated with that, above and beyond, Allport's optimal conditions are still showing stronger effects, just to be clear.
I have another question. I was wondering what could happen, or if you have done something related to adding maybe some kind of intervention with optimal condition, and also adding awareness about discrimination. And because I was thinking that maybe adding awareness about discrimination could maybe, I don't know, like make less positive effect or this contact, or maybe it could happen that you get the same positive effect on prejudice, but not the bad aspect of the contact, or correct like, I don't know if you have to think about, or you have something.
Yeah, so there have been a lot of experimental studies that implement the optimal conditions. In my own work, I've tended to work more with organizations that are already doing optimal contact interventions and helping them design measures to assess their effectiveness. So I personally haven't done as many, but
I was thinking about adding the awareness part.
Yeah.
I mean, like talking about the problem that minorities have,
Yeah.
and making everybody. Because I thought they in the optimal condition they don't really need to talk about racial issues. Just they do an activity together, no?
Yeah.
But if you add the other component, maybe you help, and maybe
it's actually quite complex. And there's many studies in intergroup dialogues that look at this, and also intergroup conflicts or ethnopolitical conflicts that look at this. What's complex about it is the dominant group can often feel very defensive if you begin to talk about inequalities, because they're like, wait, but I'm a good person. I wasn't the person who had slaves. This is what you hear between whites and blacks in the United States, for example. So you need to find strategies to help them feel as welcome as anybody else in that intergroup dialogue. So you need to try to reduce anxiety and threat. Well, this is other research that we've done, that some of the processes through which contact reduces prejudice is through reducing anxiety and threat and promoting empathy. So if you just bring them together and have them start talking about difficult issues, the high status group is going to...
Well, but maybe you can do it separately.
Well, yeah,
Like-
absolutely. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just trying to explain some of the concerns that can come up. But there is, this is part of where the in-group dialogues come in. There are programs where people spend months meeting on a regular basis. So what you often see people do is have them interact together for a while, get to know each other, feel a sense of trust, and then you talk about status inequalities because they've already started to care more about members of the other group. They know them, they trust them more, and they're more willing to hear what they have to say. If you don't have that type of trust or rapport, then it's almost like their self-concerns will take priority, right? So if you try to, in a first meeting, let's talk about, racial injustice. Whoa, wait, my family didn't have slaves. But if you start becoming friends with some black students and then you find out what they have to face on a day-to-day basis, you're like, wow, I didn't realize that. You're more open to hearing it. That's at least my interpretation.
Well,
of the
I
literature.
was thinking about not reducing the awareness about the problem of the minority. In a way, like making that these issues are still discussed, so you can still have positive feeling toward whites if
Yes.
you are black, but still,
But still
not
be motivated
to change
Yes.
society.
Yes, so that's kind of where the research is right now. So some people have started doing research looking at how if you are a minority and you interact with a member of the majority group, but you know that that majority group member does not see the inequality as legitimate, that they don't think it's fair, then you're still as motivated to engage in collective action. So people just now are starting to look at those strategies. How can we achieve both? Yeah.
¿Algún otro comentario o pregunta?
Son las 3:10. 12.
Ok. Muchas gracias, Linda.